So how many of you folks have been to a credo? All right, that's good. Uh, my biggest advice is when you get the chance, don't let it go. It's an important component. And I'm on the faculty, the emotional health faculty for the Presbyterian Credo, and one of our major themes for the emotional health side of things is resilience. And some people sometimes ask why focus on resilience, and it's because we're coming to understand certainly in the mental health area that mental wellness is not so much about the absence of mental challenges, distress, or even illness as the capacity for recovery and resilience, or what we often call bouncing back. All of us have psychological problems in living. I love that phrase, problems in living. Harry Stack Sullivan, who was one of the pioneers of modern psychiatry, wanted to emphasize, he was afraid of the labels we use that divide people into these diagnostic categories. And he says, everybody, every human being has emotional problems in living at certain times. So we all deal with psychological stresses and traumas that lead to degrees of psychological ill health at various times in our lives. In 2015, the CDC reported that 1 in 5 adults experienced a mental health issue within that 12-month period. And this percentage will likely increase in the context of this present crisis because of the nature of the stress, and last a long time afterwards. The generation after the Great Depression were people who were much affected by that. And we know from research, the big research studies, famously called the ACEs study, the study of adverse childhood experience study. We know that people who experience trauma early in their lives, people who are children now who are experiencing the impact of this and the impact of it on their parents, also will be vulnerable to various physical and emotional kinds of health problems long down the road. So in the long run, the big test of our psychological health is the resources and capacity we have developed to heal and even grow in the face of such challenges. It's not whether we're going to have them, problems in living and aftermath of this kind of thing, but whether we have, how we acquire the resources and resilience to bounce back from them. My favorite text on resilience, of course, comes from St. Paul. He says, we have this treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. That's my favorite definition of resilience. In mental health, resilience has more technical meaning, but the same idea of bouncing back, of being able to recover and find the resources for self-restoration. There's been a lot of research in this area, particularly since the aftermath of 9/11. A lot more focus on this whole idea of trauma and resilience. And as I said, I'll send you a bibliography to go with this text if you wish. The American Psychological Association has published a great little piece, which I use in my Credo presentations, called The Road to Resilience. And it has a lot of information about the kinds of things and factors that contribute to resilience. As I've tried to digest that and thought about what's most important to say about this, there are I call them the big three. There are three big things that turn out to be the most important factors in terms of people being able to have and maintain resilience. And they are connections, self-efficacy, and emotional regulation. Connections, self-efficacy, and emotional regulation. Connections. Research on resilience shows that by far the most important single factor in people's resilience is their connections, the connections that people have with other people. When I ask clergy in my little researches that I've been telling you about, what resources are you finding most important and helpful for meeting the stressful challenges you're dealing with at this moment, by far the most common responses have to do with their vital connections with family, friends, and other colleagues. And they've given lots of examples. I bet you heard some of them in your small groups. Peer-to-peer forms of connection, Lectio groups, support groups, Facebook groups, community energizing response team, Zoom gatherings, all of these things. They can take many forms, but the best of them, in my opinion, fits Parker Palmer's definition of what he calls circles of trust. I like that. Circles of trust. We need them. And he called in his definition, and I heard him deliver a speech at the Trinity Institute in New York right after, just 2 or 3 months after 9/11. So these words have stuck with me. Circles of trust he defines as the creation of bounded, safe, and trustworthy communal spaces where the soul is welcomed and invited to show up, to speak its truth, and make its claim on the living of our lives. It's a great quote. So all kinds of forms of connection I hear people talking about. Those kinds of connections, also connections with helping professionals. This is the time to battle against stigma, in a way that we maybe never have before. It's okay to need help, and it doesn't mean there's something terribly wrong with you or human about you for needing help. People also expressed in this survey I did, there was a lot of appreciation, and this is a good example of it, of denomination and judicatory executives and bodies that are reaching out and doing things like this in supportive and creative ways. In general, the most resilient people are those who have a strong relational support system that's not necessarily very large. You don't have to have the largest number of Facebook people on your friends, but they're strong, they're committed, they're large enough also that they don't over-rely on 1 or 2 people. This is particularly important for clergy to be aware of in terms of using spouses and family members as therapists and clergy support systems and so on. We need to have our own relationships with them, but we also need relationships with other colleagues so that they don't have to take the brunt of all the emotional labor that we process in our work. The second issue is, the second theme is this theme of self-efficacy, connection, self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the feeling that we have some capacity, in spite of all that we don't have control over, which is a great deal in this situation and others, the capacity to make some choices for ourselves and for the people that we care about in ways that affect our well-being in a positive ways. The things that help people with their feelings of self-efficacy in times of feelings of powerlessness oftentimes involves focusing on strengths and assets that we already have. When we're under exceptional stress, trying to recall other times we've done so and what helped us get through it. None of us reaches adulthood and certainly reaches the kinds of positions that you and I are all in without surviving a lot. We've all had to draw upon a lot of resilient resources in the past, and sometimes it's helpful to take inventory of those things, not just of the things that we think are wrong or lacking in us. Pay respect to the character strengths and other assets that have gotten you as far in life as you have so far. And focus on what you can change as well as what you can't change to make things better. Remember Niebuhr's prayer. Some of you could probably repeat it better than I can. God give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. If I could do those three things all the time, I'd be a better person. Also, increasing your sense of self-efficacy can involve starting with small steps, particularly when people are under stress and overwhelmed. Thinking about how to fix everything is self-defeat. A lot of times we gain strength just by thinking about one or two things that we do have under our control. Something that we can do, even if all we can do is be reflective in a certain way. We have some control over that. It can also involve reframing situations in ways that help us find encouragement instead of just focusing on the discouraging side of things. I love Fred Rogers' advice that he gave to when he's talking about how to talk to children about the violence and catastrophe that they see on TV. He used to say, and this is what his grandmother used to say to him when he was disturbed, whenever you see these things happening, you also see people rushing to help. Watch what the helpers are doing. Watch what the helpers are doing, because they're always there. And as in churches, we are often among them. So the other thing that came out in my conversations with clergy and in my interactions was how much self-efficacy people were getting from sharing resources with each other. I've gotten more stuff coming across my desk, wonderful stuff coming across my desk than I have in a long, long time. And I realized that people got satisfaction out of sharing resources, articles, and other kinds of things that have been helpful to them, as well as appreciative of receiving them. So self-efficacy can come with feeling like we can do something helpful, constructive in a situation where we can't do, where there are many, many, many things we can't do. Emotional regulation is the third and important one. That means being mindful of strong feelings and impulses and how we deal with them. People experience all kinds of feelings in situations like this. Grief, sadness, depression, emotional isolation, loneliness, frustration. Aggression often comes from frustration, impatience, irritability. In families where people are crowded together, it's challenging. Trying to work, parent, and become school teachers, it's challenging. Trying to figure out how to do ministry, learn how to do all the fancy things we can do in Zoom can be challenging. Feelings related, these days I'm hearing a lot of anxiety about the feelings related to the polarization and politicization of this crisis. People worried about other people's reactivity or mass and social distancing being treated as political statements. And as reopening happens, we all know there'll be more social contact and opportunity, and more opportunity for social conflict, boredom, and exhaustion, or other feelings. I've even invented a new diagnostic label for the next edition of the DSM, and it's called Generalized Crankiness Disorder. Yesterday, a client put it this way: the dragging on nature of all this is worrying. It takes more energy not to be reactive. So difficult circumstances arouse different emotions and impulses that need to be experienced and worked through in order for us to adapt and recover in healthy ways. Church is an emotional business. Ministers often have to deal with people and systems in challenging emotional situations that require us to have all our feelings while managing and even using them in skillful ways. We need to be able to have all our feelings because feelings are information that we need. The ability to have all of our feelings instead of our feelings having us, and having what Dan Goleman, the emotional intelligence guy, I like this metaphor, calls emotional hijackings. Any of you ever have emotional hijackings from time to time? Increasing, and all of that involves emotional intelligence and finding ways to learn how to be in touch with our own emotions and those of others, increase our tolerance for frustration and annoyances, increase our compassion for ourselves and others. The old advice to count to 10 really does make a difference. Brain has there's a time lag between how the lower brain, the amygdala brain, decides to go into action, and when this front part of our brain lobes are able to kick in and exercise judgment. And sometimes counting to 10 can almost get you from one place to the other. And focusing on finding safe spaces and ways of processing difficult emotions. One of my wonderful teachers and mentors and helpers said to me early in my counseling career, he said, you have to understand that in your work, you take in a lot. And if you take in a lot, you have to get out a lot. And the best way to do that is talking. It's in relationship. It's learning how to put things into words instead of having them bottled up or having them just discharged impulsively in action. So I will say, I think I have a minute for this story. I learned this lesson early on, fortunately, which is why I've always been in relationships with coaches, therapists. I don't mind saying I expect to be in analysis the rest of my life, not just because I'm crazy, which goes without saying if you ask my wife, but because of the nature of the work I do. I wouldn't dream of doing this work without having trusted supervisors, coaches, consultants, and people to help me keep track of my own process in terms of dealing with the emotional labor of the work that we do in ministry. So the other thing that people talked a lot about with respect to the things that have been most helpful to them was that they're finding that in this time they are being more attentive and thinking more about self-care, finding it harder to do in some respects, but at least they're thinking about it, and they're trying to find ways that are helpful to them and things that they can do to focus on self-care that they need in order to do the amazing work that they do. Finally, I want to add, one more observation about resilience, and I want to play with this metaphor of resilience as bouncing back, and it is. But I also want to emphasize the importance of not only bouncing back, but bouncing forward. You know as well as I do that people and organizations have amazing abilities to bounce back even dysfunctional organizations and people. And that sometimes that bouncing back is to their detriment because they're bouncing back to roughly the same shape they were in before, and that got them into the crisis in the first place. In that case, in this COVID case, the pressure to bounce back too quickly to an old normal could prove very dangerous in our society and in our churches and in ourselves. Everybody wants to bounce back. Everybody wants to know how fast we can get back to the normal that we miss. But that's not necessarily what's going to work and can happen, and not necessarily what can make us more resilient. So instead of focusing and obsessing over how soon we can bounce back, we should be thinking about how to bounce forward to a new and kinder and more sustainable future, or normal, if you want to call it that. Many of the clergy I speak with are trying to find ways of articulating this challenge in the context of our spiritual calling. What would bouncing forward look like in this crisis, not just bouncing back? These are the questions that adaptive leaders help people engage rather than avoid or run away from. For how we bounce forward from such hardship as this may prove more important, not just for us and our generation, but for generations to come, than how we bounce back. I'll just end with this comment about this sort of thing from St. Paul, when he reminds us that in terms of our reflections on resilience, we ought to do it in a different way than the way the world generally does it. And he says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. That's bouncing forward instead of bouncing back.